What interested you in Noam Chomsky?
Well, first his political work, his position, and his activism. And then after that, I realized how an important scientist he was, he is. Both aspects interested me equally. I felt I was more capable of working on talking about his scientific work, and there is already many film and video of him speaking, mostly about politics, and there is barely anything illustrating his theory on generative grammar, and I find it really compelling. Even though if I'm not coming from linguistic or even philosophy, I was very compelled to work on that.
Were you intimidated in any way either at the idea of sitting down and talking with him at length over such a long period of time, or did you find that process challenging in any way?
Yeah, I was super intimidated. I was
you
petrified.
We put that on the screen,
yeah,
I guess. But
it was hard. I mean, I had prepared some question, but I didn't know where it would lead. And I think when you do interviews, which I'm not so used to, but it's the third documentary I do, and it's very important to let the conversation lead itself. So you can prepare the starting point, but then you have to follow where it goes. But I had met him like 5 or 6 times before we started to do this project. So, but I was still very intimidated.
One of the first questions you ask him in the film, or I think it might be the first question, is the question I'll start to ask you and sort of see where it leads us. I think the first question you asked him early in the film is, what is your the first memory in your life?
Yeah.
I'll ask you the same question. What is the first memory that you have?
Well, I'm at school, and it's the first day of school, and it's preschool, so I'm 3-year-old, and which is double the age of Noam, so my early memory are gone.
He remembers being 1-year-old or something in the film.
Yes.
He says he does.
1.5, like 16, 17 months. And minutes later, so I remember turning back my head and looking at the only friend I had from before the school, before this year, and making eye contact with him, because I was very, I find it very scary to start the year not knowing anyone. So that's my first memory. And then I have very sparse memories, not like Noam says, because he described that after all his memory are coming back. They're very spread. Remember one losing my marbles in the yard, in the courtyard, and somebody trying to steal them. And it was a cloudy day, I remember that. So
somebody tried to steal the marbles. You were playing with marbles, and someone tried to take them from you.
Yeah, dropped them on the floor, and then people were stealing them.
Where did you go? Where were you in school at this point? Where did you?
It was in Versailles, called Richard Feynman.
Did you, as a kid, did you have a lot of friends, or did you kind of stay on your own, or?
I had generally one friend, and mostly the outcast. I was very interested into people who have weird background. Even in Versailles, I mean, they would stand out more in Versailles because you had a sort of a mold from this bourgeoisie. And I was always more interested by people who had weird families and weird background.
I've learned a little bit about your family through one of your previous documentaries, but would you characterize your family as a weird family also?
Well,
Or is-
it's quite atypical. Weird, it's little too much to say, but my parents were half like as a hobby, they were musicians. And we were not rich at all, not poor. We were very middle class. But remember, my father, when I was a kid, he was making the minimum wage, and then he went up. He was making microphones. But it's kind of, my grandfather was an inventor. So we were like in Versailles, but in a very small, the first floor of a two-floor house. Very sort of average, but sort of outside, a little hippie, if I say so.
My guess is that based on the work that I've seen of yours, and we'll talk in a minute about the animation process, but from seeing your music videos and the work that you do, I imagine that as a kid I picture you being very into like arts and crafts or handcrafted things. Was that part of your childhood, or did that come from your childhood, or to what extent?
Yeah, very early on, I remember drawing all the time, and I was in my family. I was sort of the artist and the person who does drawings and makes things and has creativity, and I was sort of encouraged by my parents and recognized. So later on, when I went to even at school, I was the one who could draw for my friend. I remember teaching them to draw a naked woman. I had a very simple method to do it, and then later, when you go to art school, which I did when I was 15, then you become the average, which is interesting because you have all those kids who were the best one in their classroom in drawing, and then you are all together there. So it's not that it's competition. It's it was not in Versailles anymore. It was in between Versailles and Paris, another town, a small town. And so you meet all those other kids who have the same tendencies to be the artists of their family, and they have much more various background, and they come from different parts of France as well.
How did you handle that? How did you handle the fact that I imagine within your family you were exceptional, and you're still an exceptional artist, but among other creative people, was that intimidating? Was that challenging?
Well, it was challenging but stimulating, because it was a sort of pilot, as they call it, a pilot high school.
Uh-huh.
It was a sort of different way of teaching. It was not so much about the grade. I don't have so much memories about that, but it was nice to have. Really, it's where I started to make friends that remained all my life till now, for like more than 30 years. Best friend, because we had really a lot to share in music taste and in art. And I didn't feel, I mean, in the beginning, maybe I felt a little less special, but then very quick, because everybody was different, I find my place.
Does the kind of work that we see, does the kind of drawing or the kind of work that we see in your work, in your videos or your films now, connect with the kind of work that you were doing as a kid? Do you see a connection in the types of drawing?
Especially when I would draw on the flip books, the edge on the books. It was very close to this, because basically you want to go from point A to point B and tell a simple story. So you have to find a way to make it very basic. And at school, in the art school, we had a book of jokes or gags that were happening during the day. It was a journal of all the funny bits. Like I remember one drawing when where we were nine friends, let's say, on the table for the lunch canteen was only 8 places, and there would be one who had to go into a foreign table. So we would rush to get our seat, and this was drawn by. We were like 4 people in this keeping this drawing book. In the beginning, my best friend and I were outside because we were not as skilled as the other, and then we were accepted. I remember the drawing of us being accepted in the comic book of jokes, and then we would make a fake stamp, but we draw a stamp when the gag was accepted. It was like joke accepted, or sometimes it would be joke refused.
At what point did you consider your creativity to be what you would pursue as a profession, or did you consider it a hobby, or at which point did you sort of realize that this is something you might be able to do professionally?
Well, in going to this high school, I was hoping to do that, but I didn't hope to do a film or even animation. This was not really an option. I mean, I studied tapestry.
Really?
Because it seemed to be the closest from painting, and I was I had the secret ambition to become a painter. But what was interesting and brings me back to Chomsky is, in France, the artistic world was sort of dictated by the philosophical or literary world, and I was very introverted and shy, and I didn't want. The only option I found before I found this school was to do literature high school, a specialization, and it was a bit like half a day out of the week would be specialized in drawing, and so I was much more interested by mathematics, especially geometry, and I always sort of resented this lack of connection, especially in France, where there is a lot of discourse, and I mean, at school science, I mean, probably leads to more opportunities, so it's highly regarded, but they don't see the connection between science and art. And when I started to read about Noam Chomsky, I find this connection, and I'm not surprised that he has not the deepest admiration for the French philosopher of the 20th century. And so I find this connection with him, where he comes much more from a scientific background, even though he's considered as a philosopher.
Do you remember when you first discovered his writing, or when it first sort of resonated with you, or his work?
Well, first I discovered him through videos. I watched the Manufacture Consent, and another one that was called Rebel Without a Pause. And then I read some book he wrote about Bertrand Russell and creativity, and it's one of the books he did that bridge the science world to his political work, and he talks a lot about creativity, which was very interesting. It was a subject that I always was interested into.
As a creative person, I wonder to what extent, picking up on what you were just saying, to what extent an artist needs to find either philosophical or thoughtful voices to sort of guide or help steer your own sense of your own creativity, your own confidence in your creativity, the world that you're exploring. To what extent has that been sort of necessary for you to sort of propel you forward?
Well, I remember clearly, and it's not so long ago, like maybe 10 years or 15 years, and I was talking with Charlie Kaufman, actually, about it. And I was thinking that I had a lot of concept or thinking, and they were all going in many directions. And I was asking him, how do you do to build your own philosophy? And we had this conversation. And I remember at this time looking for a way to sort of include all my beliefs and my hopes and my thinking process into one coherent process. And it's later on, maybe when I started to compile my videos and we did the DVDs, that I sort of realized I had a voice and a general direction, and that felt like a philosophy. But it's like everyone has their own philosophy, which is basically the addition of their beliefs and their interests, and then you accumulate them and you find your own sort of voice. But I had the complex to be and still to be influenceable, so that I would, if somebody would say something about a song, I would have, like, let's say Björk would say, "Oh, this artist is great," and I would love this artist. So I find I try to fight that, but I find this as a weakness, and I find that I thought that I didn't have much point of view, but then when I started to accumulate work and being asked about it, interview and stuff like that, and I started to sort of realize that I had a point of view of things and I could start to express it.
But do you mean that you were easily influenced by other creative people who give you suggestion? Very suggestible? Is that what you're... like
yes.
if Björk said, use the example of Björk, so if she turns you on to something...
In a way, yes, but I think deep down I always had a strong line. But I would, in some aspect of my appreciation of other things, my likings, I remember like a friend I had from the high school, and he had a very strong opinion on things, and sometimes I felt it was hard to stay myself. Because I was not outspoken about my taste. But it came later, and now I don't have so much this complex, although I have it sometimes. Like, if everybody criticizes my movie, I start to hate it. It's horrible.
Is that true?
Yeah, I hate this thing.
So you might feel a certain way before people see it, and then you feel differently after?
Yeah. It's a shame. It's shameful, but I have to admit it. And it's really because on the scale of a movie, it's very hard to perceive the general feeling of it. And so, because I see pieces, and I have a hard time to see the ensemble. I see all the problems I had to overcome, and things that, where it's not as smooth as driven as I wish it was. So unfortunately, I get influenced by the general opinion. I mean, it's kind of hard to admit, but it's... I mean, overall, I have a sense of... I add up now, I've done maybe 10 movies. It adds up, it feels sort of coherent, even though I went to different directions. So I have a better sense, but still, if my movie is trashed, I feel bad about it.
I can imagine anybody would feel that way. But I wonder if do you see a connection? You work in so many different formats of film, whether that be smaller animated pieces, whether that be music video, whether that be narrative films or documentary films. Do you see them all as one sort of cohesive body of work, or do you creatively do you view them very separately? And do they sort of give you certain? Do they allow you to express yourself in very separate ways, or is it all connected?
Well, I at first approach, I would feel it's all over the place. But I think, as I was saying, when I did my first compilation of videos, I realized there were one common element, and it was something that would be like a thread through the whole film, and it felt that even if they were a little scattered, that this thread would connect them, and it would make sense.
Sometimes literally thread would sort of be in the videos,
yeah.
Right? Or yarn, I guess.
Yeah, it's true.
I want to take a look at a clip from the movie, but I want to ask you one more question related to Noam Chomsky. And we were talking about sort of the philosophy of creativity and philosophy in general. When you were embarking on this film, and as you were preparing to sit down with him, and as you were talking with him, were there sort of deeper answers you were looking for, or was it more a matter of just trying to document your experience of asking these questions? Meaning, were you trying to figure certain things out for yourself?
Yeah, I mean, try to understand generative grammar and especially there is part where he describes how a single genetic mutation led to language, like 50,000 years ago. That I felt I remember this evening, I felt really enlightened. I felt, especially to hear somebody talk about a concept, something he discovered himself, is really amazing, because generally when those concept of philosophy or those point of view are so rich and deep, you don't get to know them before the person is dead or past long time. So to see somebody and hear somebody with his own voice explaining his finding was like just amazing. And it reminded me, and it's a very stretched comparison, but I went to see at the end of his life a concert of James Brown, and I was sitting there or dancing there and thinking, I'm watching the guy who playing the music that he invented.
Yeah.
And that's very special feeling, because I wish I would come back in time and be able to talk with Richard Feynman or Albert Einstein.
To see or experience or talk with someone who literally invented a particular approach or a thought,
and you feel that you sort of record the voice, and it's recorded for a good period of time. I mean, I could not say eternity, because you don't know how it's going to be in the future, but it's like you help them making a mark in some ways.
Mm-hmm.
And it's like, because you watch those, I love watching those YouTube clip on Richard Feynman, because he has a way to explain physics that's quite amazing. And I really, I am grateful that this guy took the time to take a camera and shoot him talking about nanotechnology or the universe or whatever. Yeah. So it's very rewarding to be part of this process.
Okay, so let's do this then. I want to show a clip, and then I want to talk with you specifically about the filmmaking side and the craft side of how you put this film together and the animation and some of that. Okay. But let's take a look at the clip from the film. One of the things I really like about this film is it's not just his great voice. He has a terrific voice. But to be able to listen to his voice, at least in my mind, filtered through your own interpretation, is the very kind of inherent nature of documentary. The filmmaker having a hand in, and you talk about this early on, in manipulating what the audience ultimately sees. And so I really feel like we're in this particular, in this 90 minutes, we're really kind of, we have the opportunity to kind of hear him filtered through your own imagination. Tell me about how you made the creative decisions that you did to treat this subject in this particular way.
This clip we just saw is very illustrative and narrative. So, and it's probably because it was very concrete. So he's trying to get the concept into my understanding through a very concrete example. So I want to illustrate them. But there is other time where I use abstract animation, maybe because I couldn't understand clearly what he was saying, and I didn't want to simplify my transmission by trying to demonstrate or explain. And that was my initial concept, is to use abstract animation to illustrate and help people to focus on what he's talking about. But then I realized that I had to drift in and out abstraction to keep the interest, my interest, and eventually the interest of the audience.
How many hours of conversations did you ultimately have with him to get to this hour-and-a-half film?
3 hours, basically. 4 interviews with 6 months in the middle.
And you left in the film moments where either sometimes you misunderstand each other, or sometimes you ask him a question and maybe he challenges the question or takes the question in a different way or kind of disputes. It's not a debate per se, but there's moments certainly where he doesn't sort of follow exactly where you're leading him, and you sort of left that there.
I find it was entertaining to see that, and it's fun, I think, and in a way it makes it more accessible because I've seen him talk about this concept where a very smart interviewer would make the whole thing impenetrable. And I think using my lack of, my approximative English and sometimes my lack of understanding and exposing it, it would be more sort of welcoming to the audience. And it was part of it was a sort of a comic relief in some ways. And it was funny because I would try to lead him to try to get one concept through his mind and see how he reacts. But he would stop me on one word and then expand on this word. And so I would left completely, most of my questions, they don't go very far at all. So that's why I say I feel stupid. And I really did feel stupid sometimes. But he never, he was not condescending at any point. If I had come to him with sort of an educated philosophical tone, he would have destroyed me right away. Because I've seen him in few clips talking to philosophical classes, and when a student, even if it's like a very young student, comes with how do you define the concept of reality, and he really doesn't like this pretense that you can find sometimes in philosophy. He really brings me or anyone back to the fact, and even we exchange email from time to time. And if I ask him, let's say I remember one email, do you consider history as a science? He would just not answer this one. If I ask him, like some idea that some of the mathematicians of the beginning of the century delved too much into infinity and they went crazy, and he said I didn't notice. So he would cut the conversation short when I tried to find too deep meaning. But on the other hand, if I ask him about did the Neanderthal crossed with Homo erectus, which that's the name of this term, Homo habilis, I forgot exactly the definition. He would answer me with a full page with detailed examples. In the south of Italy, I think their gene cross at this period of time, and he would send me to a link on the net to find more detail about it. So if it's a very scientific question, and it's going to answer on what's interesting with him is he answered generally in the next half hour. So you imagine, and it's sometimes the middle of the night, so I have no idea how he does it.
It's interesting. I was noticing as I was watching the film that it's a reminder of the power of words, because you can sometimes you can choose a particular word that you might later regret, because the word you chose might send him in a direction or give him the impression that you're asking a whole different question. And
it's a good lesson sometimes it gives me. Like if I say, do we have an instinct to believe in the ancient rules or science? And he would cut me off and say, no, it's not instinct in this case, it's law. And then I have no idea what law means.
Yeah.
And so he spelled it out and he explained it to me. But I think it's great because at the end of the day, I remember sending him an email saying, okay, I've been thinking a lot, and I think our intelligence is a combination of genetic endowment, law, and education. And then he delved into that, and he was like, maybe education, I would change this word. And he said, I could not find an English definition, I would use the German word. So he went very specific. And or for instance, when I in the film when I say, well, I think this is a tree because I saw it being cut, and then I saw that it grew back, and I remember it. And he said, yeah, you have a point. I think it was an advantage for the conversation and in regard to him that I was very candid. But it's true that some concept I couldn't get through. Like I wanted to try to have him answer on the fact that, okay, if we have this endowment, so there is what we make, is it a reflect of who we are? And we could never talk about that.
Just for a moment, I want to ask you about the animation process. Can you there's moments where we see you drawing.
Yeah.
Can you just fill us in on the sort of animation process that you go through, for example, for in a scene like the one we just saw?
Well, it's basically paper with Sharpie. I have my setup is very simple. I have a light box, which is big like that. And I have a stand, like any camera stand that I put with a certain angle, and I put the camera upside down, looking down, and I put duct tape all around so it doesn't move. And so I draw on my paper, and I take picture, and I draw, and I take a picture. And basically the technique that I found is that I can, because it's lit from underneath, I can put up to 3 layers of paper, so I can have parts that don't move and parts that move. And then I can accentuate. There is a little foggy effect with the fact that I use the transparency of the paper, and it's a little not always translucent. And if I give a little gap underneath the layer, it becomes, the image underneath becomes blurry. So it's very technical, but he gave me a lot of control on the texture. And then you have the light that goes through every sheet of paper, which has a different texture, so you have this vibration. And most of the time, as you can see on the poster, I switch back to negative, so it gives this sort of cinema aspect where you have the bright line over the black background.
I want to switch gears and let the audience ask questions, so there's folks with microphones.
Hi there.
Hi.
Michel, when you're going to tell a story, whether it's a music video or a movie, what part of the filmmaking process makes you more excited?
I think the idea to think of the story, and then you create the characters, and then you start to see them and think of them when you're not in between the writing, and you start to see them exist. That's the most exciting part. And then there is a visual aspect, and then the idea that it's going to look. But I think the more exciting is, and I remember from the beginning, I always did my storyboard, and I remember one of my first video when it was like a little comic book, basically, I would do, and I could be in a subway in Paris and drew my story, and especially with animation, I had no boundaries or limitation, because I knew I just would work out a technical solution to achieve the idea. So it was really exciting, and I had some idea how it would start, on the middle, on the ending, and then I would find the transition. This part of the process is most fun.
Hello, good afternoon. I wanted to ask you who is your least favorite philosopher, and why?
Well, I just saw this movie when they were quoting Jean-Paul Sartre, and I find it's a bit pretentious. And I read some of his book. I remember what's called in English, Nausea, by Jean-Paul Sartre, La Nausée. This was very strong. It made a strong impression on me. But to see him, even if he was defending, he was on the side of the worker and he would march with them, I find he was exploiting them. And so I don't like him so much. There was this sort of argument with Camus and him. And I like Camus much better. I think it's a much better writing, and there is philosophy in his writing that is much more complex and interesting than to say evil is the other. I mean, or the essence precedes being, or those texts on existentialism. I think you can really have a very basic and simple answer to those, in my opinion, to those questions. If you study a bit of biology, for instance, and you realize, okay, well, you come out as cells who divide, and then basically you become what you make of your life. And that's this question, but answered in a much more pragmatic way. So that's an example. But I'm very ignorant. It's hard for me to answer this question because this was not my interest when I grew up. I had more interest into science, astronomy, the geometry, mathematics, and not that I'm a specialist in that, but I find it more stimulating. And then I read novels and like, for instance, I read George Orwell not so long ago, maybe 10 years ago, and I found this critique of society very, I mean, it was much more interesting than some philosopher.
Bonsoir. I was wondering if you had a conclusion about the filmmaker industry you did in Paris, in Beaubourg. La Machine à Film.
Yeah, the home movie factory.
And if you wanted to recreate the experience again once.
Yes, I did it in many places and it keeps going. I think we're going to do to Morocco in the spring. And I mean, in between we went to, it's a home movie factory in which I provide sets for anybody who wants to come, and they come in groups with a friend, and it's not necessarily for artistic people, it's for people who don't know they have artistic capacities, and they make their own film, and they write their story, and then they make the film, and then they watch it. And that was actually one of the first reason why I wanted to speak with Noam Chomsky, because he was speaking about the sort of, he has this democratic approach of creativity, and the work that his wife did with children was very much connected to that. So this is a part of my work that I find very gratifying, because it's sort of my way of being political. Because basically what I'm saying is like anyone can be creative, and then most of the time you hear and you watch the creativity of specific people who are sort of privileged and they are in the circle, and you never hear people who are outside of the circle, and because they are outside of the circle, they could have something more interesting to say. So this all it makes sense to me, and it's sort of we were talking about if I had a philosophy. I find the philosophy in this aspect. So I will continue to do it.
You mentioned Chomsky's wife, and before we take this question, can we watch one more clip from the film? Because we have another clip ready, and I don't want to leave it out. It's a beautiful sequence. It's a beautiful sequence.
Yeah, he was very emotional talking about his wife. So.
Hi, Michel.
Hi.
I would like to ask you, how did you convince Noam Chomsky? Like, how did you meet him, or how did you convince him?
I was invited to MIT in residency, and I met a lot of teachers and students, and this was very illuminating for me, because it was exactly the place I felt home. Because they were constantly bridging between science and art. Some of the projects were more art, like contemporary art, and some of the project was more scientific, and you have all a range of projects between the two. And then I realized he was there too, and after 2 or 3 times visiting MIT, I asked if I could meet with him. So I met him like for 20 minutes, and then maybe a few months later or 6 months later, I met him another time. And after 5 times or 4 times, I suggested to him to do this project. I had done an example of animated abstract animation that I did for a video, and I showed it to him, and he said, "Okay."
Well, the film opens at the IFC Center this Friday, and Michel will be there on Friday and Saturday doing discussion, doing Q&A, and the film will also be on iTunes starting on Monday. So thank you very much for spending the evening here. Thank you, Michel, for your time.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Okay.